I wanted to give you just a little bit of background. Anne mentioned the current edition of the textbook, which is on the far right, the most recent edition. But the predecessor, the woman on whose shoulders I like to think that I stand, is Deborah Winter. She was a social psychologist who taught at Whitman College for many years. And she wrote this book, which was published in the mid-90s. I found it during a sabbatical, fell in love with her writing style, fell in love with her personality as it came through in her writing, and wrote her just out of the blue and said, you know, this is who I am. I teach at Willamette in Oregon. I'm wondering if you're at all interested in revising your text, which I think is brilliant, but I have some ideas for updating and revising it. So we worked together on the second edition. And on the third edition, I took the lead authorship on that edition. And then when it was time for a fourth edition, I was feeling burned out. Deborah had retired. And so I recruited some colleagues in Minnesota, Britton and Elise, who then stepped up, took the lead, and did a fabulous job on this most recent edition. So a couple of these are up here. If you're interested in taking a look over the break, you're welcome to. They're also available on Amazon and Better World Books. So check it out. So when you hear the term environmental problems, such as the title of one of our texts, probably evokes some images. Some certain things come to mind. I would normally ask you what those images are, but since we're being filmed, I'm afraid your answers wouldn't come up. But maybe some things like this. Pollution from industrial processes, lots of traffic and emissions that are coming out of our tailpipes. Waste, landfills, polluted soils, sludge leaking out of industrial effluents, electronic waste, all of the phones and computers and so forth, you know, those build up in landfills. Maybe deformities or birth defects or problems in other species, deforestation, maybe climate change and kind of the iconic picture that we associate with climate change and loss of habitat for polar bears and other species. But the reality is that these are not environmental problems. What all of these things have in common is us, is humans. And in fact, the problems are stemming from ecologically incompatible worldviews and associated beliefs and attitudes and values that determine our actions. If we did not behave in destructive ways, there would be no problems. If we didn't pollute, if we didn't drive cars that emit carbon dioxide and other pollutants, there would be no so-called environmental problems. So we can conclude then that environmental problems are really behavioral problems. Psychologists to the rescue. Not to say that psychology is the only relevant discipline here. Obviously, we critically need interdisciplinary investigations. We need chemists, we need biologists, we need climate scientists, we need lots of different disciplines working together, and we need citizens working with us as well. But psychology, being the scientific study of human behavior, can make a critically important contribution to understanding why do we continue to behave in unsustainable ways, and how do we motivate people to behave differently. So maybe some of you have heard of the term ecological footprint. This is a measurement. It's been around for probably at least a decade or 12 or so years. It's a measurement of how many resources an individual consumes, or a group or a population, and how much waste is produced as a result of those consumption patterns. And we can calculate how big our footprint is as an individual or as a population in terms of things like what do we eat, what our energy use looks like, our consumption of consumer goods, consumer products, how much waste we generate, how big our home is and associated land use and heating and cooling costs, electronics use, and travel, including both local and travel that's beyond local. Well, a few statistics in terms of people just in the United States. We often eat food that is out of season or out of region. Most of our food travels around an average of 1,500 miles to get to us. We're pretty local here in Salem. There's a wonderful farmer's market, so a lot of us do try to eat more locally. But on average, across the US, most travels pretty far. We discard about 130 million cell phones and hundreds of millions of computers and TVs, only about 10% of which is recycled. And even if we do make a concerted effort to recycle diligently, that still involves a lot of waste. Recycling is not as good as just reducing or refusing to get caught up in the planned obsolescence of such kinds of technology. You know, they're only built to last a couple years. We throw them out, we get a new one. Or even, again, if we recycle them, there's still a lot of waste in those production processes. We use about 30 times more gasoline than people in the developed world on average. And it's worth noting, people in the developing world are very anxious to live our lifestyle, right? So even though we are currently outpacing pretty much every other countries are working to catch up with us, which doesn't bode very well for our use of resources in terms of sustainability. There we go. We generate, oops, sorry, that got cut off. We generate more than 20 times the trash compared to people in the developing world. We use more raw materials, about 20 times the amount of paper, nearly 700 pounds of paper per person per year. 700 pounds, can you imagine? And we use 25% of the total available commercial energy supply, 84% of which is wasted because of our inefficient processes. And by the way, what percentage of the US, what percentage of the world population is the United States? Less than 5%. So less than 5% of the people are using more than a quarter of the world's overall energy supply. And we could make similar conclusions about the waste and the petroleum that we use. If everyone lived like we do in the United States, we would need at least 4 planet Earths. But sadly, you know, we only have 1. So how do we make sense of this disconnect between our lifestyles and our planetary impact? Well, there's an artist, photographer by the name of Chris Jordan. You can access his work at this website, who has depicted what consumption patterns look like, I think, in really creative and evocative ways. So if we blow up this picture, we see the number of aluminum cans used in the United States every 30 seconds, 106,000 every 30 seconds. Another kind of interesting graphic here that kind of looks like some sort of industrial tubing or something. We start seeing, they're plastic cups. 1 million plastic cups used on airplane flights in the United States every 6 hours. So really, I think, gets us thinking about these patterns, these lifestyle choices that we don't even think about. They bring you a plastic cup of your drink and you're happy, and they bring you another one an hour later. So let's talk about our feelings. I'm a psychologist, right? So this is probably what you were expecting. You know, I'm going to ask you about your mother, and I'm going to ask you about your feelings. Well, how many of us feel a little bit guilty? Or a little bit overloaded or overwhelmed? Very common. A researcher and writer by the name of Theodore Roszak coined this phrase, ecological overload and green guilt. Does that motivate you to go out and change the world? Probably Probably not. You know, guilt and overload kind of weigh us down. They kind of start making us feel bad, and we want to just sort of crawl into our shells. Similarly, B.F. Skinner, one of the founding fathers in psychology, wrote that the principal modus operandi of environmentalists and environmental groups and scientists, we could throw that in there too, is to frighten people rather than to offer them a world to which they will turn because of the reinforcing consequences of doing so. The reality is that the way the message has been framed for the past 30, 40 years has actually acted against motivating us to do things differently. It's kind of shot us in the foot a little bit because it hasn't offered a positive vision. It hasn't offered a world that looks better to us. It just keeps reinforcing the status quo. We can look at Freud. You know, although Freud is not given the credit in a lot of academic circles that I think he deserves, he really was brilliant, he really was ahead of his time, he talked about defense mechanisms. He said that when we feel anxiety, when we feel overwhelmed, we cope by trying to manage our emotional experience. And he listed several different kinds of, I'm going to come back to that in a second, different kinds of defense mechanisms that we probably see operating in our everyday lives. Rationalization. Well, I'm only one person. It's only one plastic cup. Does it really make that much of a difference? Can I really make that much of a difference? I might as well drive my car. Everybody else is doing it. Anybody relate to those kinds of messages? We're rationalizing. We're making ourselves feel better, and we're managing our anxiety. Not necessarily helping to solve the problem, but making us feel better. Intellectualization. We can get caught up in debates about the science. We can get caught up in the abstract numbers and statistics. Well, is it going to happen is climate change going to happen this quickly or that quickly? Is it going to happen here or there? We start debating the facts, and we get lost in those intellectual debates, again, as a way of managing our anxiety. Anybody familiar with denial? It ain't just a river in Egypt, as they say. Ha-ha, denial. Ha. We can either deny that the problem exists. There's no problem. We're doing great. We're affluent. We're privileged. We don't have anything to worry about. Or we can deny our own impact. Back to that, I'm only one person. Or our own responsibility. What can I really do to make things better? We can suppress the information. I don't want to think about it. I'm going to turn the channel. I'm not going to read the newspaper. I'm going to watch mindless TV. I'm a real fan of Netflix these days. It's a great way of just sort of tuning out and not paying attention. At the extreme, suppression can be substance use and substance abuse, so producing its own kind of mental health challenges. We start seeing addiction because people are trying to numb out. It's too painful. There's too much anxiety here. I don't know where to go with all of this anxiety. Lifton was a writer during the Cold War with US and Russia. Talked about how we were poised on the brink of destruction, nuclear war and mutually assured destruction, and said that people were numb. They're just tuning out. You know, we go about our daily lives and we try not to think too much about these threats that are potentially catastrophic and destructive to literally civilization as we know it. So all of these are techniques that we all engage in to try to make ourselves feel better. Not sure why things aren't clicking. There we go. But we get caught up in a positive feedback loop. We have these problems like a changing climate and pollution that leads to this defended state of anxiety. You know, we're rationalizing, we're intellectualizing, we're suppressing, which ends up enabling actions that further hurt the environment. Anybody ever hear of retail therapy? Using material goods to try to feel better. A lot of energy, a lot of raw materials being used, a lot of waste generated, contributing to pollution and climate change, causing more anxiety, and so on and so forth. How do we get out of this? Well, one of the other defense mechanisms that Freud wrote about was called sublimation. This is our efforts to channel the anxiety into something more productive, something that will actually help to solve the problems rather than contributing to them. So things like biking or walking instead of driving, things like planting your own garden, hopefully in an organic and sustainable method, or working on a community garden or going to farmers markets. Things like trying to reduce our own energy consumption, line drying instead of using machine dryers, or other steps that we can take to change our energy use, reducing the heat setting, or reducing the amount of heat that we're using, reducing the amount of gas that we're using. Or we can also help to support clubs and organizations that are actively working to address environmental issues. I just picked the Sierra Club. There are dozens. And we can also, offer financial support to organizations that are working on these issues. I think it's important to note that we have to be careful to also pay attention to our own lives and to not just say, well, I donate to this organization, so I don't really have to do anything else. It can kind of make us feel good in the short term. But to really take a look at our own lifestyles and to really think, are we living in a way that we feel comfortable about, that we feel good about? So there are several subdisciplines of psychology that can contribute to our understandings. And I want to start with cognitive psychology, particularly as it relates to this relatively well-known quote by Christoph, writes for the New York Times. If we learned that Al-Qaeda was secretly developing a new terrorist technique that could disrupt water supplies from around the globe, force tens of millions of people from their homes, potentially endanger our entire planet, our entire civilization, we would be aroused into a frenzy and deploy every possible asset to neutralize that threat. Yet, that is precisely the threat that we are creating ourselves through climate change, through global warming. What is the difference between a terrorist threat and climate change? Why would we be aroused into a frenzy if there was a terrorist responsible for these kinds of changes? Well, cognitive psychologists have talked about psychological or cognitive dissonance. Is the threat, is the experiencing happening here, now, to me, or to people, or the individuals that I care most about? A phenomenon called proximal cognition. From an evolutionary perspective, it makes sense, right? Our ancestors would have been paying attention to threats that are up close and personal. What's threatening me, my family, my tribe? Didn't have to worry about threats that were happening potentially in another country or on the other side of the world. We're very visually dependent creatures. Our eyesight is very important to us. And so if it's something that we can't directly see, it's a lot harder for us to understand it or take it seriously or pay much attention to it. Again, from an evolutionary perspective, you can think about how our ancestors relied primarily on their vision to detect threats. We weren't smelling the people from the neighboring tribe coming close, or if we were, it was kind of after we saw them coming. This is another important piece. Is the change sudden and dramatic? If all of a sudden the climate changed, 10 degrees in a month, we might notice it a lot more readily or easily than if it's protracted, if it's gradual, if it's slow. Because our senses adapt when change is slow. And have I heard it all before? How many of you feel like you're just tuning out to the news because it's kind of the same bad news day in and day out. We habituate. We stop paying attention. I'm not sure what's with my clicker here. Another aspect from cognitive psychology, how many of you feel like your minds are full rather than feeling mindful of our experiences, including our interconnectedness and our relationships to other species and to the natural world as a whole? Turns out some interesting research recently, mindfulness is getting a lot of popular press, a lot of attention in the research communities because of its potential benefits. Health, for example, chronic pain, high blood pressure, risk for heart disease and stroke, migraines and other kinds of headaches. All of these kinds of physical maladies are very amenable to treatment with mindfulness practices. It's also associated with lower ecological footprints. Kind of makes sense. If we're more mindful, if we're paying more attention, if we're more in the moment, we don't consume as much. We don't need retail therapy as much. We're not as likely to overindulge in food or alcohol or other kinds of substances that we sometimes use to manage our anxiety. We have better health outcomes. I mentioned some of the physical outcomes. Mental health outcomes include lowered risk for depression, lowered experience of anxiety disorders, less post-traumatic stress disorder, and overall subjective well-being. People who practice mindfulness techniques, whether it's yoga or meditation or just kind of being present with your experiences, are happier. They feel better. They report feeling better about their lives and are more resilient, which is a critical piece as we start to see more impacts from climate change and pollution and other threats. That will create anxiety in and of itself. So our ability to weather those storms, both literal and figurative, will be enhanced by things like mindfulness practices. Stereotypes are another kind of important cognitive accessory, if you will. It's kind of a mental shortcut. This was a very interesting study that some colleagues of mine conducted. They gave participants this description. Particular senator, Senator Johnson, under pressure from concerned citizens, voted against this bill because it would allow drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. So one group of participants read that description. Another group read, Senator Johnson, under pressure from environmentalists, voted against the bill because it contained this provision to allow drilling. Very interesting findings. You might anticipate what I'm going to say here are that the participants that heard the concerned citizen story were significantly more likely to say the senator's decision was appropriate. It was appropriate to vote against the bill because it would have allowed drilling. Whereas in the environmentalist conditions, nope, he made a mistake. He shouldn't have voted against the bill. And further, in the environmentalist condition, they disagreed with the senator's decision even when on the very same survey, they themselves stated that there should be no drilling in the Arctic. Isn't that interesting? The word environmentalists is so loaded these days, maybe has been for 20 years because of the political partisanship and the images that the word evokes, that it really affects how people make decisions. And this is really important in terms of thinking about political language or legislative efforts, advocacy, lobbying, and so forth. How things are worded is very important in how people are depicted. You know, are these concerned citizens or are these environmentalists? So that was cognitive psychology, to give you a sense of that subdiscipline's contribution to understanding this. Behavioral psychology, I mentioned Skinner. He's one of the most well-known researchers in the field of behavioral psychology. looks at the antecedents to our behavior, the behavior itself, and then what happens as a result. So for example, a choice like, should I ride my bike today? Well, why am I riding my bike? Is it because I'm not on a bus route? Is it because my car won't start, I don't have a car, or I'm just trying to be more environmentally aware and ride my bike more? Well, that choice is going to have certain consequences. I'm either going to be reinforced for riding my bike, I'm going to have more fun, I'm going to increase my fitness, get those endorphins flowing, feel better. I've also avoided having to pay for parking and car maintenance as well as gas, so I'm saving some money. Those are going to reward me and increase my probability of riding my bike. But there are other things that can happen too, right? It's cold, it's wet, especially here in Oregon, I might get wet. I don't get there as quickly, it's not as convenient, I can't run a whole bunch of errands because I'm more time constrained. All of those things are going to reduce my biking. So we kind of have to look at this in terms of the different kinds of choices that we're confronted and evaluate what are the relative costs and benefits, basically, to any given choice, and how likely am I? And unfortunately, the way current infrastructure is set up, oftentimes it is the more environmentally destructive choice that is reinforced, right? Driving is easy, it's relatively cheap. Gas is pretty cheap here, particularly when you compare it to other countries, like Europe, for example. It's a lot more convenient. A lot of us feel not particularly safe on bikes because of all of the traffic, and we don't necessarily have bike lanes and so forth. Bus or other public transportation often is a little bit more difficult, or there are barriers. So this really provides a lot of insight then into why we oftentimes don't make the choice that would be more pro-environmental. That relates to this concept that the situation that we're in, the situational constraints are very powerful, and this kind of draws from both behavioral as well as social psychology. We are often caught in contingency traps where the short-term versus the long-term goals conflict with each other. So short-term benefits are much more powerful even when they come with long-term costs, right? So the short-term convenience of driving my car really outweighs the long-term costs in terms of climate change or pollution or even effects on my health. I'm not getting as much exercise. Again, from an evolutionary perspective, makes a lot of sense. Our ancestors didn't spend a lot of time thinking about the future. They were very focused on the here and now. Similarly, short-term costs significantly outweigh long-term benefits. So if I have to pay money to increase the insulation in my house, that cost is going to be more significant in my decision making, even though I would save money in the long term. That's known as a contingency trap. We're caught between these short and long-term aspects. Social traps, maybe some of you have heard of the tragedy of the commons. An ecologist by the name of Garrett Hardin described this in the 60s or 70s, talked about how in any given common area, say we're all cattle farmers and we're trying to graze our cows, any individual farmer is very motivated to graze as many cattle as he can. He gets more meat or more dairy, he's able to sell more, provide more for his family. But if every farmer makes that same choice, what happens to the commons? It gets degraded, it's overgrazed, there's way too much manure, there's not enough grazing area, and we all suffer. Every individual is acting rationally, and yet at a cost to the larger group, of which each farmer is a member. So we're kind of caught here, too. We're all trying to get the most bang for our buck. We're all trying to use as many resources as we can to benefit ourselves, to make our own lives easier. But since we're all acting in that way, it ruins things for everybody, including ourselves. But again, that's a long-term problem. I don't have to worry about that right now. That's going to be an issue down the line, but not right now. Well, so the outcome of this is that rampant individualism, our country is known for this, right? It's I'm all out for number one, or it's all about me. We're very individualistic. And we don't have a whole lot of accountability yet. There's nobody really holding our feet to the fire. That's resulting in this tragedy. But there are ways up. There are ways of spiraling up. The commons can be triumphed over if we recognize our community, if we recognize that we are part of the larger whole. And I'm as concerned about you and your welfare and your ability to graze cattle as I am about my own or myself. So as we form stronger social networks, this group is a great example of that, right? You guys, I assume, get to know each other. I saw many of you having lunch together. You have cohesiveness, you have a collective, and you care about each other's welfare. The more we can build that into our neighborhoods and our places of residence and our workplaces, the more we will feel accountability, the more we will feel less individualistic and more part of this collective, and more willing to work collaboratively and cooperatively to try to reduce these kinds of adverse impacts that we were talking about. A couple other solution approaches. Many of us see these kinds of prompts when we're leaving rooms to turn off the lights. Saying please makes a difference. Again, there have been studies looking at use of polite and words like please make a difference in terms of increasing people's cooperation. Providing incentives, the nickel back on bottles is a great example of that. It's really easy to bring our bottles back and collect those funds. And highlighting the long-term consequences, since we tend to be so focused on the short term, paying more attention and being aware of the potential long-term problems can help to solve these problems that we're talking about. We'll talk in the second half of the session about some of these carcinogenic and toxic effects. Another example of a solution approach is to highlight what are known as social norms. So currently, a lot of our norms are around consumption and overuse. But there have been some great efforts. Hotels, you might recognize this kind of thing from hotels that you've stayed in, if not particularly the Sun Court in New Zealand, where they talk about trying to minimize impact on our environment. Help us save water and reuse your towels or reuse your bedding. Put this card on your bed if you'd like us to change your sheets. Otherwise, we'll save some water, we'll save some use of detergent. And paying attention to more responsible tourism. That's highlighting social norms. People who stay here care about this. By definition, then, you should care too, and this is a way that you can help if you do care. I mentioned framing earlier, the fact that a lot of the framing around environmental issues has been a series of the bad news. And I love this quote. Imagine how history would have turned out had Dr. Martin Luther King given an I Have a Nightmare speech. Would we have made the progress that we've made? Now, granted, we haven't made as much progress as we need to, but we certainly have made at least some progress on civil rights. And I think this really highlights, again, the environmental movement has not done a good job in the sense of these continual I have a nightmare speeches. So we need to think in terms of what would offer a more positive vision, something that would be more forward-looking and forward-thinking. This is a good example of that I saw pretty recently. Is climate change the greatest health threat or the greatest opportunity? From a positive framing, addressing our changing climate will provide more clean water and sanitation, can improve our health, can improve crop yields, improve the amount of food that we're growing. Nutrition will then be improved, and particularly if we're concerned about social justice. and people in other nations who perhaps are suffering from malnutrition. Addressing these issues can help to address those environmental injustice kinds of phenomena and promote more sustainable development. So here are some things in terms of thinking again about our own behavior, our own impact. Individual household actions in the US, I talked about some statistics, generate more than a third, about 38% of carbon dioxide emissions. Producing just over 2 pounds of beef generates the amount of carbon dioxide equivalent to an average car driven 155 miles. Isn't that staggering? That eating, a beef dinner probably between 2 people is like driving, from here to Eugene and back again 3 times, something like that, 2 times? Not sure my math is right there. And of course, industrial production of cattle also generates methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas. Producing just 1 pound of beef uses as much water as taking 60 showers. And we have been subject to drought conditions the last several summers. California is in very dire straits in terms of water. So think in terms of the water consumption used just to produce meat. So when we think about, actions that we can take to be more sustainable, to be more pro-environmental, we often think about things like driving our car. We don't necessarily think so much about what we eat. And yet what we eat, if we're on a meat-based diet, can have a very significant impact. So the reverse is true. If we can cut back, don't necessarily have to give it up, but if you can cut back, reducing by 15%, reducing by 50%, how much of a difference that would make in terms of your climate contributions. The other point that I wanted to make here is being specific, not just highlighting what are the problems, but highlighting this is what we can do as individuals, as households, as collectives, is a lot more motivating, again, than just being focused on the sort of gloom and doom stories. Make it public. If we commit to another person, we are much more likely to honor our commitment. I thought about passing this out, but I thought I would just put it up here instead. And I don't know, can you guys read that okay in the back? Is the print, okay, I'm seeing some disagreement. So I'll just read through this quickly. Note 1 or more commitments that you feel ready to make and indicate your personal priorities. Would you sign a petition? Would you gather signatures on a petition? Will you join with others to make our residents carbon neutral? I want to explore ways I can divest financially from fossil fuels in my personal investments. Send me information. I am ready to make the following lifestyle changes. Is that a hint? The lights went down? Oh, okay. Oh, so you can read it. I got it. Thank you. I'm like, okay, time to leave, Sue. So I'm willing to make the following lifestyle changes. Reduce the amount of meat I eat, walk, bike, or take public transit at least once a week. Again, it doesn't have to be an all or none kind of situation. It can be, trying to reduce our reliance on driving. Keeping your tires inflated, regularly servicing your car can reduce its emissions, reduce how much gas it gobbles. Lower my thermostat in winter, raise it in summer. Install low-flow shower heads, line dry instead of using the dryer, other. If I were doing this in a more official capacity, if I were to pass out these commitment cards, have you fill them out and turn them back in, you would be much more likely to follow through on that than if you just think about it and say, yeah, I might think about doing that. So maybe during break, talk to a partner, talk to somebody sitting next to you and say, what are you willing to commit to? This is what I'm willing to commit to. And then hold each other accountable. Next week, follow up. Did you hold your word? Because never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. This well-known quote by Margaret Mead, sociologist. anthropologist. So, and my timing, boy, I couldn't have done that better, could I have? 15 minutes for questions. So please. Hello? Okay. Roz Sharak, where'd you go? There you are. Mentioned that the university is, there are a number of students at this university who are working to try to get Willamette to divest from fossil fuels in its investment portfolio. I mentioned divestment as one of the things that we can do as individuals. And so there are some petitions circulating to promote that effort, that divestment effort. So if you're interested, please see Roz, raise your hand again. So people know where you are. Please see her about maybe supporting that petition. One of the questions that came up during break was about the fact that we're, to some extent, tuned out to what's going on because it's the new normal. And there are researchers that have talked about, particularly in children, think about the environment that current children are experiencing and what it looks like. You know, it's polluted, they're experiencing the effects of climate change, there are droughts and other environmental influences, there's a degradation of spaces for play and kind of natural settings, what we think of as natural settings, are not as prevalent as they used to be. And for them, that is normal. And so with each generation, we lose more and more because we lose that appreciation. They don't have the generational memory, if you will, of what things could be like. And so I think that was a really important point. I'm glad that person asked the question. Something to keep in mind in terms of another reason as to why maybe it's difficult to appreciate the severity of our problems. I also heard that some people were having difficulty hearing me during the first half. I really apologize for that, and I really wish you would have said something, but hopefully this is better. You're hearing me better now? So I'll use this for the second half. So I want to talk more specifically now about environmental health and its connection with human health, public health. So we've kind of already seen that there's a disconnect between ourselves as individuals and our larger environment. The reality, though, is that the environment provides air, water, soil for foods, and constitutes our life support systems. And I think this is another good example of framing effects, that when we talk about the environment, it kind of seems like it's something outside of ourselves, something separate, something that's not really relevant to us, you know, kind of humans versus the environment, without recognizing that we are an inextricable part of the greater whole, and we are dependent on that whole for our very lives, for our very survival. Rachel Carson was kind of one of the early voices in this area, as many of you know. Her critical book, Silent Spring, kind of highlighting the health risks, public health risks of cancer and reproductive abnormalities that were seen as a result of pesticide use, agricultural pesticide use. Her book was published in the 60s. She actually died of breast cancer, potentially because of exposure to such carcinogens. And I might have mentioned this term earlier, eco-psychology was kind of the perspective that when we are disconnected emotionally, physically, spiritually from the natural world, that causes distress and disease. So not only are we sort of pumping out toxins that cause disease processes like cancer, but we are also struck with things like anxiety and addiction and depression because we are disconnected from our home, from our mother, from our larger kind of place in the world. I lost my clicker. But the reality is that what is bad for the planet, what is harmful for the planet, in turn is bad for us, and vice versa. What's good for the planet is good for us. So we've already talked about some of these emotional reactions to hearing news about climate change. But coincidentally, these are some of the same reactions that are caused by a changing climate. So for example, we're likely to experience increased aggression, interpersonal conflict, societal conflict as resources become more scarce, more conflicts over water, for example, and more conflicts over other resources as they become more scarce. As people lose their homes or lose their sense of place or have other kinds of disruptions in their lives, there will likely be profound grief. Mentioned, just anxiety, worry about what's happening and what might happen. Post-traumatic stress disorder, people who've lived through tsunamis and floods and hurricanes definitely suffer from post-traumatic stress, might be more likely to, again, engage in things like substance use and abuse, might start feeling hopeless. We have kids being impacted by the stressors that their parents are experiencing, might be acting out, might be experiencing emotional consequences themselves. So again, it's kind of this circular feedback loop that news about it causes problems and the experience itself causes mental health issues. Even schizophrenia, the most profound mental health disturbance, has been associated with climate change. So I want to kind of focus in a little bit. So there's public health effects associated with climate change. There's also public health effects associated with various toxic chemicals that we encounter. Various kinds of chemicals can act as direct neurotoxins, so damaging the neurons, the nerve cells of the brain. They can cause mutations in our genetic code, some of which can lead to cancer. And there are other carcinogenic properties of various chemicals we're exposed to. Teratogens are chemicals that directly cause birth defects. And various kinds of toxic chemicals can disrupt our hormonal systems. And hormones regulate virtually every physiological process in our bodies. So if our endocrine system is affected, our brains are affected, our bodies are affected in various ways, reproduction is affected, and so forth. There are a number of toxicants. I'll just put this list up there. So heavy metals, we've known for a number of years, lead and mercury exposures can affect brain development, can cause brain damage. Pesticides includes chemicals that are designed to kill insects, rodents, weeds. That suffix "cide," like suicide, homicide, pesticide, chemical that's designed to kill a pest. And what is a pest? Is that a biological category? We have mammals and we have pests. Actually, a pest is anything that humans find annoying. So, use your imagination what we could think about pesticides for. There are chemicals in plastics. Bisphenol A has been getting a lot of public attention lately, and you might see on certain plastics it'll say BPA free, advertising its lack of that particular chemical. Now, we don't know what they put in its place, but at least we're avoiding that potential endocrine disruptor. And phthalates. Various chemicals are put into our furniture, our mattresses, our upholstery, our draperies that reduce the potential for fire hazard, but act as toxins or endocrine disruptors in their own right. A number of personal care items, shampoos, cosmetics, body lotions, soaps, and so forth contain fragrances. And if you're concerned about this, look for paraben-free products, because parabens are phthalates, which disrupt our endocrine system. Computers, electronics, both the plastics as well as some of the innards contain chemicals, metals that can disrupt the endocrine system. Solvents, industrial agents and byproducts, additives, anything not on this list that we use on a regular basis. So the upshot is that we are exposed to a variety of compounds that can affect our physiology and can seriously affect brain development. And of course, air pollution is a conglomeration of other kinds of chemicals. We are seeing epidemic rates of childhood developmental disabilities, autism spectrum disorder, attention deficit disorder, learning disabilities, dyslexia, as well as just general cognitive deficits, antisocial behavior, also known as conduct disorder, various kinds of mental illnesses that affect children, like depression and anxiety, brain atrophy and malformation. All of these are becoming more and more prevalent. I do see your hand. I'm still doing that. I was trying really hard to pay attention to that. Okay. I'm not used to teaching with a mic, so apparently I'm still not very skilled at it. I will try harder. Okay. Is that better? Okay. Well, thank you. I was trying to ignore your waving hand, but so, okay, I will try to be better. I'm really sorry about that. So again, many of these are reaching epidemic proportions and are very much associated with exposure to various kinds of chemicals. One of the problems from a regulatory standpoint is that researchers are expected to prove cause and effect. Exposure to this chemical produces developmental disabilities or produces autism. It's very, very, very difficult, if not impossible, to draw those cause-effect relationships because, A, we don't have a good control group. We don't have a group of kids that are exposed, a group of kids that are not exposed with whom to compare the kids who have been exposed, because everybody's exposed, as I think is evident by the wide-ranging kinds of chemicals. There are also basically toxic soups. All of these things can combine together and produce additive effects or interactive effects that are larger than any singular compound. One of the biggest challenges is that there are over 85,000 different chemicals registered currently with the EPA. About 100 of those have been specifically tested for health effects on humans, so 100 out of 85,000. And only about 15 at the most have been specifically tested for neurological effects. 12 to 15 out of 85,000. Lot we don't know. And how do we test every single compound out of 85,000? And then how do we test all of the potential interactions? This plus this, this plus this plus this. Any mathematicians in the room? Can you tell us how many we're talking about there? I mean, astronomical numbers. Plus, some of these, so again, from an ethical point of view, you know, we can't specifically expose some kids to particular toxins and compare that to another group that hasn't been exposed. But most of the research that is being done, the minimal amount that is being done, is done on non-humans. How do we test for subtle intellectual impairments in rats? How do we test for subtle attentional impairments in even chimps? So it's very difficult to find an animal model that is appropriate for testing for many of these kinds of neurodevelopmental disabilities. kids are not the only ones affected by exposure to different kinds of toxic chemicals. Adults can suffer from reproductive abnormalities, can also develop schizophrenia. Reproductive abnormalities can account for increasing difficulties becoming pregnant. You know, a lot of women, a lot of young couples are having difficulty with pregnancy, possibly attributable to the chemicals they're being exposed to. We're also seeing an increase in transgender or gender dysphoria. People whose gender assigned at birth, male or female, isn't really consistent with how they identify. You know, I was born a female, but I really feel like a male, or vice versa. Is that a social phenomenon? Is that a phenomenon attributable to reproductive changes and brain changes associated with exposure to different kinds of chemicals? If our hormones are being messed with, it's very likely that there's a connection between those phenomena. And again, research is very much behind in answering some of those questions. So that's adulthood. Later adulthood, Parkinson's, accelerated aging, or premature cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, becoming much more common, and there's some very good evidence to suggest that, at least in part, because of toxic chemical exposures and effects, again, on neurological function and status. So again, I like to try to frame things in terms of specifics. What can we do? What can we do to avoid these kinds of exposures? Well, we can contact our legislators. We can contact manufacturers of products and say, you know, why are you putting flame retardants in these consumer products when these chemicals are known to be associated with disabilities and brain changes in brain development? We can look at our cleaning products and other chemicals that we have in our households. So for example, very good idea to avoid bleach. Bleach is highly toxic. You know, that's why it says don't inhale it, use a lot of ventilation. It's highly toxic. Many commercial cleansers contain bleach or similar kinds of chemicals. Baking soda is a very effective scrubber for sinks and tubs. Vinegar with water, and sometimes even undiluted vinegar, depending on what you're cleaning, is a very effective cleaner for windows and floors. You know, our grandparents knew this, your parents knew this. They didn't have the kinds of commercial cleansers available to them, and did just fine. One thing that's kind of interesting is how germ-phobic we are, and how we're so willing to use some pretty strong kinds of chemicals to protect us from germs, when in fact the chemicals are causing their own problems. The other thing that's kind of interesting about that from a developmental point of view is that kids actually need to be exposed to germs. They need to be exposed to dirt. They need to be exposed to bacteria, because those things promote development of the immune system. If they don't have those kinds of exposures, they often have immunodeficiency issues. And so we're kind of doing them a disservice in that way, as well as the potential effects on brain development. Plastics, I mentioned there are several chemicals in plastics that are known to disrupt our endocrine system. Ironically, a lot of products designed for children's use are made out of plastics. Baby bottles are plastics. A lot of chew toys for teething are made out of plastic. Toys and mobiles and so forth are plastic. And so there's kind of this irony that we're surrounded by plastics during those very vulnerable early periods of brain development, when plastics can affect that. Oops, excuse me. Microwave safe labels, you know, they're nice and all, but they are actually inaccurate. Any plastic container can leach into the food that you're heating up in your microwave. So it's best to not use plastic containers or plastic wrap when you're microwaving. Rather use glass or ceramic. That includes things like bringing your own containers to restaurants. I've seen a variety of people who are starting to do that now. Not only are you reducing waste and reducing the resources that go into creating those containers, but you're also then using a glass container or something ceramic that then you can use to reheat and not have those chemicals that'll leach in. Mentioned pesticides and the potential effects of those. We can make choices in terms of buying organic that not only supports farmers who are trying to reduce or restrict their use of pesticides, but also reduces the amount of pesticides that we're exposed to. This is also a social norm issue. We have this idea that to keep up with the Joneses or keep up with the neighborhood standards, we shouldn't have weeds, we shouldn't have bugs. If we bite into an apple that has a wormhole, oh my goodness, how awful is that? But again, that's kind of a social norm thing. So other species are part of the web of life. They're part of the environment. They're part of a healthy environment. When you have bugs and worms and ladybugs in your garden, that's actually a good thing. That's the sign of a healthy garden. So recognizing that other species, weeds and bugs are normal, a pristine golf course type lawn is not. That is not normal, and that's a very resource intensive kind of landscape. And again, when we have resource challenges, best to get away from those kinds of landscapes. Or if you really need to get rid of the pests, like say there's a flea issue with your dogs or cats, don't necessarily have to buy the highly toxic flea controls. You can use less toxic pest controls like diatomaceous earth. Works pretty effectively for things like ants and fleas if you have an extent to which you don't feel comfortable living with. So I mentioned, what's bad for the planet is bad for us, and vice versa. What's good for the planet is good for us. It turns out that the kinds of environments, the kinds of settings that are healthy and more pristine and sort of more in their natural state are also restorative to us in terms of our mental health. Kaplan, 20 years ago, talked about how contact with healthy nature acts as restorative in terms of getting us away from regular demands and stresses. It's appealing to our senses. There's a sense of vastness or connection, and again, can be kind of a spiritual experience if you're on top of a mountain or you're surrounded by what we think of as beautiful natural settings. And particularly if the activity is compatible with preferred activities, whether it's walking or skiing or rafting or other kinds of connection with nature. And again, quite a lot of research suggests that things like anxiety and depression and even substance use and abuse can be addressed therapeutically through contact with these kinds of healthy environments. There are a number of programs for children, including children with difficulties like conduct disorder, that involve like wilderness experiences and outdoor health. Also for women who've been subject to domestic violence, helping during that recovery and healing process. Being out in nature can have a very restorative effect. Many of you may know that sort of from personal experience. So I know that our time is shorter, so I wanted to make this section fairly short so we had plenty of time in case there are more questions, including from the first half. So that's kind of all I had for the formal part. So shall we? Thank you. Oh, there we go. So, questions?
this is Kathy, and this is just a story. I was hiking in the mountains up in the Cascades someplace, and I could hear thump somebody coming down the trail just as fast as they could go. And this young man, filthy, dirty, came to me and he said, "Have you got a cigarette?" They were in an outward bound program from New York City.
That's great. Thank you. But, you know, while he's going back with the microphone, just something to think about. You know, we're very aware of the risks of smoking and drinking during pregnancy, for example, and we're aware of the effects of secondhand smoke. And so it shouldn't be that much of a stretch to recognize that it's not just those kinds of substances that can affect brain development and can affect child development, that the developing brain, the developing physiology can be very vulnerable. And so, you know, to think about the kinds of chemicals we're being exposed to. So, good, thank you.
Yeah, Sue, my question has to do with banning certain types of chemicals. Now, I know individual countries do that, but is there an international organization where this ban will apply worldwide or among agreement countries?
There have been attempts at that. The POPs agreement, persistent organic pollutants, the REACH agreement, which is about registering, evaluating, and assessment of chemical health, something like that. It won't surprise you to know that certain federal leaders have refused to sign on to that. Obama did make some efforts on those, but you can imagine that those will not be held up. In general, it has been very difficult, even under Obama, it has been very difficult to shift that culture within the U.S. because we are so chemically dependent, you know, in a lot of ways. And it's a very powerful lobby in Washington. The other thing from a regulatory point of view is that other countries, particularly Sweden and some other European countries, have adopted what's known as the precautionary principle, which states that if there is any potential for a product to cause harm to either humans or the environment, it cannot be marketed. It cannot be released. So, taking precaution. Our legislative system is literally built on the principle of innocent until proven guilty. We will not ban a chemical until it is proven harmful to human health. And I mentioned some of the reasons why it's very difficult to prove harmful to human health. So that's why we have 85,000 some chemicals and growing, is because you can put anything out there and then just wait and see if the research will ban it. The other issue is that even if there is incontrovertible proof that this particular chemical is carcinogenic or is a neurodevelopmental toxicant, and you ban it, it's still in warehouses. It's still in people's garages or shops, and it's still being used. And so how do you completely get rid of it once it's been out there? You know, the shutting the door after the horse is already out, something like that, is really a big problem. So there are a number of ways in which we have fallen short in terms of cooperating with those kinds of agreements that could be international, but aren't yet. Thank you.
Hi, this is Lester. Perhaps you could help us understand the social, psychological issues that allow people to vote against their best interests, which is so evident when you talk about environmental issues and other regulatory issues with the most recent election.
Boy, do I wish I could explain that. I am frankly stymied. I do not know. And I would like someone to explain that to me, frankly. The other piece that I really don't understand is how things have become so polarized with respect to environmental issues. It does not make sense to me how anyone could vote against the Clean Air Act, could vote against the Clean Water Act, could vote against protecting kids from the effects of toxic chemicals. Like, how is that even a political issue? You know, how is it not just a recognition that without these basic protections, we don't live and we can't thrive? And so how is it that we, you know, take action to try to promote health, to try to cure disease like cancer and Alzheimer's and diabetes? You know, how do we support those kinds of health lines of health research and not recognize that, you know, air, kind of important, water, kind of important, you know? I wish I knew. If I knew, maybe I'd win a Nobel Prize. I just don't know. Yeah.
Hi, this is Solveig back here.
Oh, okay. Hi.
I'd like to have your thinking on the problem about the fact that some people don't trust the water supply in their own community, so they buy cases of bottled water, so they pollute, and the cheap water has plastic that leaches, you know, all of that. How do we get to the bottom of all that?
Yeah, great question. And again, kind of like a feedback loop, right? Because there are problems with water quality, so then we have to buy bottled water. We think we have to buy bottled water, which then a lot of plastic, a lot of waste, the chemicals in the plastic that are problematic. We are so lucky here in Salem and Oregon in general that our water supply is so good and so healthy and tastes the way I think water is supposed to taste, which is like nothing. Doesn't leave an aftertaste, which I think is a good thing. And yet, even people here have kind of bought into the bottled water phenomenon. It just reminds me of a story. Evian, I think, was one of the first, if not the first, water bottlers. Do you know what Evian spelled backwards is? Naive. Hey, let's put a bottle under this tap. Let's fill it and let's sell it. And I bet there are people out there gullible enough to buy it. And guess what? You know? And again, I think it's an example, and maybe this comes back to Lester's question as well, the power of moneyed interests, you know, the power of groups that are working to make a profit at any cost to public health, to environmental health, to other species. You know, if the bottom line is going to go up, and we certainly are seeing that with Nestle, you know, privatizing water, and the California situation, trying to fight those efforts to privatize water. You know, how do we start seriously working to get money out of the political system, out of our governmental system? How do we reform campaign finance such that the people who are making legislative decisions are not under the thumb of the big corporations? You know, these are huge issues. These are, you know, way beyond my pay grade. But I think it's a piece of the puzzle that we really have to pay serious attention to, that it can't continue to be all about the money. Doesn't work. Yeah.
This is Maureen. One thing that we can do that I've been doing for years is to request the material safety data sheets, MSDS sheets, on any products that are used around our home by people who are doing work there. And in fact, one time we were having work done outside, and I told Phil, don't you dare sign that agreement until I ask for this. And I asked the contractor, and he said, lady, nobody has ever asked me for that information before. But that will tell you what chemicals are present in the products they're using, what the precautions are, what happens to a human being if you ingest that or get it on your skin. And it gives you some power to say, I want you to use an alternative. I don't like this.
Yeah, great. The power of being an educated consumer, right? There are also some really great websites. The Center for Environmental Health has a lot of information for consumers. The Environmental Working Group has a searchable database. So like, for example, I was talking about personal care items like shampoos and body lotions and soaps and that sort of thing. Sunscreen, you can plug in your favorite sunscreen or your favorite product, and it'll tell you what kinds of effects are associated with it, whether it's high on the toxicity scale or low on the toxicity scale. And if it's higher on the toxicity scale, is it because of reproductive problems? Is it neurological, neurotoxic? There's also an organization more locally in Eugene called the Northwest Coalition for Alternatives to Pesticides. Their website address is very easy. It's just pesticides.org. And again, they're in Eugene, and they have a lot of information about commonly used pesticides and their potential health risks and what you could use instead. So yeah, being an informed consumer, asking for that information when people are doing work for you, or before you continue to buy certain products, finding out, what am I exposing myself, what am I exposing my family to? And the power of the dollar, as much as I said, trying to get away from moneyed interests, but if we start putting our money, putting our dollars, putting our support behind companies that are trying to do the right thing, that are trying to be more health protective and more sustainable, those companies will grow more than those that are less conscious about those things.
This is Roz. I was wondering, through your teaching, working with students, do you see much generational difference between, say, students and baby boomers or older in terms of their anxiety or fear about environmental problems, or their hopefulness, or their willingness to be directly involved in solutions?
It really varies. I don't know that I could make a generational comparison. I think there are individuals in every generation that are aware and conscious and trying to do their best. I think there is a spirit in a lot of our students and in a lot of people that I just interact with, friends and family and so forth, who feel a very strong sense of fear and despair and hopelessness around all of the different challenges that we're facing, not just the pollution and changing climate, but around racial issues and women's issues and children's health and immigration and on and on. There's so much to worry about and so much to be concerned about in the current climate. And I think, I was mentioning to somebody during the break, that I think our best hope and the thing that also really helps to promote resilience is strengthening communities. And I was mentioning this a little bit in the first half as well, that feeling a sense of social connection and feeling a sense of belonging is so critical for our development, for our mental health, for our physical health, as well as giving us energy and feeling a sense of empowerment to do what needs to be done, to do the difficult work. And so things like the marches that happened this weekend and the March on Washington 2 years ago about climate change, the efforts to mobilize around that, to the extent that those kinds of events tell us that we're not alone in these kinds of concerns, and that we have a community, and that there is a way sort of out and forward, is so critical. And I think that one maybe upside, one benefit to this is maybe it will bring people more together around these sort of different issues, to see that there's sort of a place of common ground and a common starting point maybe. I don't know. That's, I don't know if that answers your question. I mean, again, I think from a societal point of view, we tend to be so isolated and individualistic. You know, we drive in our individual cars and we go home to our homes where maybe there's just one or two other people. And we're in these little boxes so often. And we maybe need to find more ways of getting outside those boxes and connecting with other people, whether it's through your faith or through, you know, organizations or nonprofits you're involved in, or activism, or this kind of forum. Making those connections is so important. Casey?
Hi, this is Jim, way over on the other side.
Thank you.
And I'm just tagging on to Maureen. She got there before I did. But the material data safety sheet, back in the 80s, anyone working in state government, if I remember correctly, as an office manager, more or less, or director, I had to inform all my employees of the dangers of any material in the office. And the material data safety sheet included everything, like ozone coming out of a copy machine, or all those things, Scotch tape, what the dangers were of any of those materials. And it was a requirement of the state for everybody. So at least we made some progress at that point. I don't know if they still do that or not, but.
Interesting. Yeah, I don't know. Anybody respond to that?
I have a comment from private industry. When I first moved to Salem back in 2008, I worked for a temporary agency, and they had a very delicious smelling interior office. Sometimes it smelled like cinnamon, sometimes it smelled like peaches and cream. But I found out to my horror that it was a artificial air freshener chemical that was getting replenished every week. They had a giant rectangle box mounted on the wall, and the guy came and refilled it every week with these giant jugs. And one time I took a look at the side of the label on the jug, and it was just massive lists of chemicals. And it wasn't too long after I started working there that my employer was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. And her oncologist said to her, "It's probably your air freshener."
Wow. Yeah, there's actually a book. I'm not going to remember the name off the top of my head. It was written by an oncologist, and her argument was basically that chemical companies often have pharmaceutical divisions, and that the same companies then that profit from these chemicals that give you cancer also profit from creating the drugs that cure the cancer.
Hi.
So take that,
To see you again.
something to think about.
Just one last thing. You may recall, and I know you do, that about 10, 12 years ago, the city of Salem tried to establish an environmental commission, and it was immediately set aside by the incoming city council. But for the little bit of a run that it had, it was actually pretty good. It was talking about electromagnetic radiation from power lines and things like that, and water issues and so forth. Well, we're now 15 years beyond that, and currently the current city council, incoming city council, is looking at possibly reestablishing not an environmental commission but a sustainability commission. So they haven't got that far yet, but it is on their list of goals. And so if you think, you all, being residents of Salem and local environments, if you think this is a good idea, please call your city councilor and tell them to put it on the top of the agenda and get with it, because we really do need such a thing.
Thank you. Maybe one last question? Yeah, Casey served on the city council a number of years ago.
Well, I think maybe we're out of questions here, but although there's probably many questions floating around here, but thank you so much for a comprehensive presentation.
Thank you so much for coming.